Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the late-night streets of Detroit, where factory lights glow through misted windows and power moves quietly behind closed doors. This is the world of Joseph Zerilli, a man who ruled not with noise, but with steady hands and careful decisions, where loyalty was currency and patience was strength. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of danger alone, but because it demanded thinking 3 steps ahead while never showing your cards. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's hidden corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city hum fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculating world of Joseph Zerilli. The Detroit air in the autumn of 1910 wasn't just cold. It tasted of coal smoke, river damp, and the sharp promise of a new world for those daring enough to seize it. In a cramped, warm kitchen in the neighborhood they called Little Sicily, the scent of simmering tomato sauce and baking bread fought a winning battle against the industrial smells outside. At the head of a worn wooden table, a man named Antonio Zerilli sat, not as a king, but as a father, a laborer, a figure of quiet authority. His hands, calloused from work the city offered in abundance, loading cargo, digging foundations, were surprisingly gentle as he peeled a small, bright lemon, the yellow a stark contrast to his dirt-lined nails. Watching him intently was his 10-year-old son, Giuseppe, who the teachers in the crowded schoolhouse already called Joseph. The boy's eyes didn't follow the peeling knife. They followed his father's face. There was a silence in Antonio that Joseph found more instructive than any lecture. It was a silence of calculation, of observation, of storing away information about people, about debts, about respect. "Pa," Joseph finally asked, his English still flavored with the music of their native Terracini, Sicily. "Why did we leave? Nana says the sun there kissed the orchards. Not like this." He gestured vaguely towards the window and the gathering dusk. Antonio finished peeling the lemon in one long, continuous curl, a small feat of patience and skill. He placed the vibrant peel on the tablecloth. The sun there also baked the dirt of the latifandi, the big estates, Giuseppe. It kissed the backs of men who worked it but never owned it. "Here," he said, splitting the lemon and handing a segment to his son, the sour juice already beating. "Here, a man can own something, but you must understand the soil here is different. It is not just earth and rock. It is made of streets, of buildings, of the wills of other men." Joseph put the lemon segment in his mouth, his face puckering at the intense sourness, but he didn't spit it out. He met the bitterness, just as he was learning to meet the taunts of other boys for his accent, his different clothes. His father smiled, a rare crack in his solemn demeanor. "Good. You feel it? Life is often aspro-sour, but within that, there is strength. It wakes you up." The lesson was interrupted by a sharp, urgent knocking at the back door. Not the front where friends and neighbors came, the back. Antonio's eyes changed in an instant. The softness vanished, replaced by a focused intensity. He didn't jump. He slowly wiped his hands on a cloth, stood, and motioned for Joseph to stay seated. He moved to the door, opening it just enough. Joseph couldn't see the visitor, but he heard the low, rapid Sicilian dialect, words tumbling out like stones. Asterisk problem, Antonio. El camion. I ragazzi di Polak. Asterisk problem. The truck. The Polish boys. Antonio listened, then simply nodded. Asterisk va bene. Dillo a Salvatore che ci vediamo al posto. Asterisk, tell Salvatore we'll meet at the place. He closed the door, the weight of the world seeming to settle back onto his shoulders. He returned to the table, but not to sit. He placed a heavy hand on his son's head for a moment. "Joseph," he said, switching to English for the lesson's gravity. "To protect what is yours, your family, your respect, your chance, sometimes you must speak softly. But you must also make sure everyone understands the words, even if you do not shout them. You understand. Joseph, the sour lemon taste still on his tongue, nodded, though he only half understood. He understood the fear in the messenger's voice and the calm in his father's. That calm, he sensed, was more powerful than any shouted threat. Go help your mother, Antonio said, putting on a worn coat and a flat cap. I have business with Uncle Sal. As his father slipped out into the charcoal gray of the Detroit evening, Joseph picked up the curl of lemon peel from the table. It was still, supple, fragrant, a piece of a sunnier world. He didn't see a piece of trash. He saw a thing of purpose. Even after the fruit was gone, the peel remained useful, fragrant. He carefully put it in his pocket, a talisman. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the distant hum and clang of the city, he thought not of orchards, but of soil made of streets. He thought of his father's calm voice in the face of a problem. And he felt, for the first time, not like a boy dreaming of old sunsets, but like someone beginning to learn the complex geography of the new world right outside his door. A geography his father, Antonio Zerilli, was quietly, determinedly mapping, one relationship, one understood agreement, one necessary meeting at a time. The story of Joseph Zerilli did not begin with a bang, but with a whisper in a steamy kitchen, the taste of lemon, and the silent exit of a working man into the night to tend to the fragile, nascent thing called his family's future. It was a future being forged not in the fiery steel mills of Detroit, but in its shadowy, human intersections, where trust was currency and a man's word, backed by his resolve, was the only contract that mattered. The years that followed were a classroom of brick, pavement, and human nature. Joseph Zerilli, the boy who saved lemon peels, grew tall and observant. He did well in school, but his real education happened after the final bell, walking the bustling streets of the Eastern Market District with his father or his uncles. He learned the price of produce, the right firmness of a cheese, but more importantly, he learned the marketplace of men. Antonio and his associates, men like Salvatore Catalanot and Angelo Melli, were not the cartoonish gangsters of later pulp novels. They were businessmen of a particular kind, solving problems the official authorities either couldn't or wouldn't. A shopkeeper being extorted by a reckless, independent bully would find the bully persuaded to leave permanently after a quiet word from Antonio. A dispute between two fruit wholesalers over a delivery route would be settled not in a chaotic courtroom, but in the back room of a cafe, with espresso and a handshake. Justice, in their view, was local, immediate, and based on a clear understanding of consequences. Joseph, now a serious young man of 16, was often a silent presence at the periphery of these meetings. He was the one who would hang up the coats, fetch another bottle of wine, or stand by the door, a living indicator that the conversation was private. He heard everything but said little. His father's lesson was being absorbed. Power often resided in the quietest man in the room. One crisp afternoon in 1916, Antonio sent Joseph on an errand. It seemed simple. Deliver a sealed envelope to a man named Mr. O'Mara, who ran a warehouse near the riverfront. Give it only to him. Look him in the eye when you do, then come straight home. No conversations, no stops, Antonio instructed, his gaze holding Joseph's until the boy nodded. The warehouse district was a canyon of grimy brick and echoing shouts. Joseph found O'Mara, a broad-shouldered Irishman with a bristling red mustache, overseeing the loading of crates. He was flanked by two burly dockworkers who eyed the slender Italian teen with open suspicion. Mr. O'Mara? A message from my father, Antonio Zerilli, Joseph said, his voice steady. He didn't shove the envelope forward. He held it out, deliberate and calm. O'Mara took it, his eyes narrowing. He tore it open, scanned the single line of writing inside, and his face underwent a remarkable transformation. The bluster drained away, replaced by a pallor that even his ruddy complexion couldn't hide. He looked from the paper to Joseph, and in that moment, Joseph saw it. Not fear of him, a boy, but fear of the name he represented, the unspoken agreements that name upheld. The two dockworkers, sensing the shift, took a step back. You tell your father, O'Mara began, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. You tell him it's understood. Fully understood. Joseph merely nodded the way his father did. He didn't ask what was understood. He didn't need to. The transaction was complete. The message wasn't in the note. The message was in the delivery, in O'Mara's reaction, in the demonstration that the Zerilli word, even delivered by a son, carried weight. On the long walk home, a mix of pride and unease churned in Joseph's gut. He had felt the tremor of his father's influence, a tangible force that could change a man's demeanor with a slip of paper. It was intoxicating, but he also remembered the look in O'Mara's eyes, a look that spoke of compressed anger and humiliated pride. Joseph understood instinctively that such a look could fester. Respect that was rooted in fear needed careful tending, or it could turn poisonous. That evening, over a dinner of pasta and beans, Antonio asked no questions about the errand. Instead, he talked about the olive harvest back in Sicily, a seemingly innocent topic. But woven into the story were lessons about patience, about knowing the exact right time to pick the fruit. Too early and it's bitter, too late and it's spoiled. About how a single rotten olive could taint the whole press. Joseph listened, twirling his pasta. He finally spoke. "Pa, O'Mara." He agreed, but he didn't like it. Antonio paused, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. He gave his son an appraising look, a faint glimmer of respect in his dark eyes. "Good, you saw that. If he had smiled too wide, he would be a liar. If he had refused, he would be a fool. His dislike is honest. It means he will remember the agreement. Our job is not to be liked, Giuseppe. It is to be believed. It is to ensure that when we speak, the world knows we mean what we say. That predictability, that word, that is what allows businesses to function, families to eat, and streets to be safe for our people." It was a heavier responsibility than Joseph had imagined. This wasn't about bullying or intimidation for its own sake. It was about establishing a brutal, alternative order in a city that offered little protection to immigrants. It was a system with its own ethics, its own brutal logic. Later, in the tiny room he shared with his brother, Joseph took the old, dried lemon peel from his childhood drawer. It was brittle now, brown at the edges, but still fragrant when he held it close. It was a reminder of that first lesson. Life is sour, but within it is strength. He was starting to grasp the staggering scale of the sourness his father navigated daily. And he was beginning to understand that the strength to navigate it couldn't come from anger or bluster. It had to come from something as unyielding, as patient, and as deeply rooted as his father's calm silence. The boy who carried messages was being prepared, line by line, to one day write them. The streets of Detroit were his parchment, and the lesson had just begun. The world turned, and with it, Detroit roared. The end of the Great War didn't bring quiet. It brought the deafening thunder of factories running at full tilt, and the chaotic symphony of a city exploding with new money, new people, new temptations. For Joseph Zerilli, now in his early 20s, the lessons of his father's kitchen and the warehouse district were about to be tested in a crucible of national madness. Prohibition. The Volstead Act descended in 1920 not as a law, but as a golden opportunity draped in moralistic cloth. Overnight, a vast, thirsty market was created, and the men who could quench that thirst would wield power beyond anything the old neighborhood padrones had ever dreamed of. Antonio Zerilli and his close-knit circle, the Castellamarese clan from the old country, men like Salvatore Catalanot, Angelo Melli, and the rising, fiercely ambitious Black Bill Taco, saw not sin but supply and demand. Joseph was no longer a message boy. He was a lieutenant, a thinker. He had his father's calm demeanor, but with a sharper, more analytical mind. He watched as the family business pivoted. They didn't just run small-scale operations. They began to organize. It was Joseph who had a head for numbers and logistics, who often sat with the maps and ledgers, figuring out the routes. One evening in 1923, in the back of a legitimate-seeming social club on Monroe Avenue, a meeting was underway. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Present were the old guard, Antonio, Catalanot, and a powerful new ally from the west side, Sam Giancana, a man with eyes like chips of flint. And then there were the young Turks, Bill Taco, fiery and impulsive, and Joseph, the quiet planner. The Canadians, Sam Giancana was saying, tapping a thick finger on a map of the Detroit River. They have the quality. The Purple Gang and their Jewish boys in the city, they have the distribution. We have the ports, the docks, the police in our pockets. We are the middle, the vital organ. If we squeeze, the whole city gets thirsty. Bill Taco leaned forward, his voice eager. So we squeeze. We demand a bigger cut from the Canadians or we shut down their crossings. We muscle the purples out of the best territories. Antonio listened, his expression unreadable. He then turned to his son, who had been silently tracing supply lines on the map with his eyes. Joseph, what does your thinking tell you? All eyes turned to him. It was a test, a public one. Joseph cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the gaze from the hardened men. He thought of O'Mara the warehouseman, of the sour lemon, of the danger of a festering wound. Muscling is expensive, Joseph began, his voice low but clear. It brings police attention we don't need, and bullets we can't afford. The Canadians have good product. The purples are wild, but they are effective. If we fight them, we bleed money and men. If we work with them, we become the system. Bill scoffed. Work with them? They're animals. They are businessmen, Joseph corrected, a subtle firmness entering his tone. Ruthless ones, just like us. We don't need to love them. We need to predict them. We propose a consortium, a board of directors, for whiskey. He allowed a faint, rare smile. We control the riverfront, the judges, the union bosses on the docks. That is our share. We offer them safe passage, guaranteed neutrality for their trucks, and smoothed over legal troubles. For a percentage of every barrel that crosses, we become not their competitors, but their essential partners. Their overhead. The room was silent. Sam Giancana stared at Joseph, a new appreciation dawning in his flinty eyes. Antonio's face remained neutral, but a prideful gleam touched his gaze. It was a vision of order, of consolidation. It was the move from street-level thuggery to corporate-style corruption. Catalanot nodded slowly. The boy talks sense. A war on two fronts is suicide. But being the toll bridge on the only road to riches, that is a permanent business. The plan was adopted. Joseph, in his mid-20s, had just helped architect the Detroit underworld's most profitable and stable arrangement. The little Jewish navy of the Purple Gang ran the risky rum-running boats from Canada. The Zerilli Taco Catalanot Meli organization, which newspapers would later clumsily dub the Detroit Partnership, controlled the landing and the city. Money flowed in like the river itself, but with immense success came new problems. Joseph found himself navigating a different kind of sourness. It wasn't the straightforward threat of a rival. It was the corrosive effect of wealth and paranoia. He saw men change. The simple code of honor and respect his father preached was sometimes twisted by greed. He had to mediate disputes over territory that was already theoretically shared. He had to gently rein in Bill Taco's more violent impulses, appealing not to morality, but to the cold logic of profit and low visibility. One night, after diffusing a potential clash between their crew and a rogue group of Polish bootleggers not with threats, but with a negotiated territory split, Joseph walked home alone. The city was alive with illegal jazz spilling from speakeasies, the rumble of trucks carrying contraband. He had helped build this machine. He was wealthy, powerful, respected far beyond the streets of Little Sicily. Yet he felt a profound solitude. He could trust fewer and fewer people. The lemon peel in his pocket was now a dustless, fragile thing, kept in a small metal cigarette case. He didn't see it as a symbol of strength anymore, but as a reminder of a simpler truth, a purer purpose that was getting harder to grasp amidst the torrent of dollars and deception. He was becoming a king of a shadow empire, but the throne, he was starting to understand, was a lonely and perilous seat. The real test would not be in building his power, but in holding it together as the pressures from outside and the weaknesses from within inevitably began to crack the foundation he had helped design. The era of the mobster was dawning, and Joseph Zerilli was at its very heart, a calm, calculating center in the gathering storm. The roar of the 20s was not just in the speakeasies and counting houses. It was in the very foundations of Detroit, a city being reborn in steel and gasoline. Joseph Zerilli, now a man of substance in his late 20s, understood that the river of money from Prohibition could not last forever. Wise men built bridges, but wiser men bought the land on both sides of the river. He began to look beyond the nightly shipments of Canadian whiskey. His personal life, too, began to take shape. He married a young woman from a good Sicilian family, a quiet, strong-willed woman named Filomena. She knew the source of his wealth, but in their home on a tree-lined street in the increasingly fashionable Northwest Side, he was just Joe. Husband, a man who appreciated fine things, quiet dinners, and the order of a well-run household. It was a sanctuary from the chaotic pressure cooker world he managed by day. It was at Filomena's urging that he made one of his first major legitimate investments, a small, struggling bakery on Michigan Avenue. The owner, a Neapolitan named Enzo, was a brilliant baker but a terrible businessman, drowning in debt to a bank and to a vicious loan shark named Moretti. Joseph didn't muscle in. He approached Enzo not as a savior, but as a partner. "Your bread," Joseph told him, sitting in the flour-dusted back room. "It tastes like my grandmother's. This is a gift, but a gift does not pay the furnace bill." He laid out a simple offer. He would clear all of Enzo's debts, including the one to Moretti. He would invest in new ovens, a proper storefront. In return, he would own 70% of the business. Enzo would run it, bake as he wished, and take a salary plus a share of the profits. Enzo, his eyes wide with fear and hope, stammered, "And Moretti? He will not like losing my interest payments." Joseph allowed himself a small, cold smile. "I will have a conversation with Mr. Moretti. He will understand. You will bake. I will handle the rest." The conversation with Moretti was not one of violence, but of calculus. Joseph met the loan shark in a public diner. He laid out the new reality. The bakery was now under his protection. The debt was considered paid. In fact, Joseph suggested if Moretti wanted to invest in a future venture, a piece of the linen supply business for the hotels they controlled, there could be an opportunity for him. The message was clear. It is more profitable to be my ally than my adversary. Moretti, seething but pragmatic, took the deal. The bakery flourished, becoming the first brick in a wall of legitimate holdings for Joseph. This strategy of assimilation, of turning rivals into stakeholders, became his hallmark. He applied it to the unions, springing up in the auto plants. While others saw them as a nuisance, Joseph, through intermediaries, saw a leverage point. He helped install friendly officials in key positions, ensuring strikes didn't disrupt the trucking companies he had an interest in, and that the union pension funds found their way into certain investment opportunities. It was clean, quiet, and incredibly effective. But the high-wire act of balancing his two worlds, the legitimate businessman and the underworld capo, was constant. The pressure came to a head during a family dinner in 1928. His younger brother, restless and impulsive, had been involved in a clumsy, unsanctioned hijacking of a rival's liquor truck. It was a breach of the peace Joseph had meticulously brokered. His father, Antonio, now graying and less involved in day-to-day affairs, was furious. "You bring heat on the family for a truckload of scotch," he admonished his younger son at the table. "You think like a bandit, not a builder." Joseph sat silently through the outburst. Later, in his father's study, the old man turned to him. "He is your blood, Giuseppe, but he is also a liability. How do you handle a liability?" Joseph looked out the window at the peaceful street. He thought of the bakery, of the tidy profits, of the quiet satisfaction of building something that would last. Then he thought of the chaotic, dangerous world his brother's actions threatened. "I handle him," Joseph said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. I will make him a manager of a warehouse, a legitimate one far from the action. He will have a title, a salary, and men who report to me watching him. He will feel important, but he will be in a cage of his own making. A gilded cage is still a cage. Antonio studied his son, seeing not the boy with the lemon peel, but a ruler capable of difficult, calculating mercy. It was a solution that preserved family loyalty while neutering the threat. It was cold, but it was necessary. You see the long road, Antonio said, nodding slowly. This is good. But remember, Giuseppe, the longer the road, the more enemies can gather along the sides. And sometimes the enemy is not the one shouting at your gate. Sometimes he is the one sitting quietly at your table, waiting for you to stumble. The warning hung in the air. Joseph had mastered the art of dealing with external threats, of turning them into assets or removing them with surgical precision. But the internal threats, the envy of allies, the ambition of subordinates, the weakness of family, were a far more insidious poison. As the decade careened towards its spectacular, crashing end, Joseph Zerilli stood at the pinnacle of a vast, hybrid empire. Yet, in the quiet of his study, he felt the first cold drafts of the coming storm, a storm that would test not just his strategies, but the very foundations of the delicate, powerful world he had built. The Great Depression was on the horizon, and it would demand a kind of leadership for which there was no playbook. The storm broke not with a single crash, but with a slow, suffocating descent. The headlines of October 1929 screamed of Wall Street's collapse. But in Detroit, the disaster was a creeping tide. First, the fancy downtown stores saw fewer customers. Then, the auto plants began to slow their relentless pace. The symphony of industry became a stuttering, uncertain rhythm. For Joseph Zerilli, the Great Depression was the ultimate test of his philosophy. To be the calm center, the man who could provide predictability in a world gone mad. The river of prohibition money began to thin. People still drank, but they drank cheaper and the profit margins tightened. The easy, extravagant wealth of the 20s was over. Joseph saw the despair on the streets, the bread lines, the hopeless faces of men who had once proudly worked the assembly lines. He understood that, in this new landscape, raw power was useless. What people needed was survival, and survival could be a business too. He called a meeting of the partnership in the back room of a funeral home they owned, a place that, ironically, was seeing more business than ever. The mood was grim. Bill Taco argued for doubling down on vice. People need forgetfulness, Joe. Numbers, booze, women. We give it to them cheaper, but in volume. Joseph shook his head, leaning over the polished wood table. No, Bill. A desperate man will pay for a meal before he pays for a dream. Our strength was always in necessity, not luxury. We need to pivot. He laid out his plan. The organization would become, in essence, a shadow bank and a shadow welfare state for their community. They scaled back the flashy speakeasies and focused on essential distribution. But more importantly, they expanded their loan operations. Not the brutal, break-your-knees kind of lending, but a structured, if still stern, system. A man who lost his job at Ford could come to a social club and, with a character reference from a known associate, get a loan to keep his family in their house. The interest was high, but it was a lifeline banks refused to give. We keep the roofs over their heads and food on their tables, Joseph explained, his voice calm amidst the anxiety in the room. In return, they owe us, not just money, loyalty, votes when we need them, silence when we require it. We become their only safety net. He also moved deeper into controlling essential services. Their garbage hauling businesses took over new routes at cut-rate prices, squeezing out smaller operators. Their linen supply company secured contracts with the remaining hotels and hospitals. These were recession-proof, ugly, unglamorous businesses that generated steady cash flow. Joseph was burying the organization's roots deep into the bedrock of the city's daily life. This shift brought him into direct, personal contact with the human cost of the Depression. One bitter winter morning in 1932, a man named Karl, a German immigrant and a master, mechanic who had worked for one of their controlled auto shops, came to see him. Carl was a proud man, his hands permanently stained with grease, now trembling not from cold but from humiliation. He had fallen behind on his VIG, the weekly interest payment. "Mr. Zerilli," Carl stammered, his eyes on the floor of Joseph's modest office above the bakery. "The work, it's gone. My daughter, she is sick. The medicine, I have the principal. I will pay it all, I swear. But the VIG, I cannot." Joseph watched him. He saw not a debtor, but a skilled asset in distress. He thought of his father's lesson about the sour lemon, the strength within. This man's dignity was the peel. Crushing it served no one. "Carl," Joseph said, his tone not friendly but fair, "you are a good mechanic." "Yes." Carl looked up, confused. "Yes, sir. For 30 years. The loan is paused. No VIG for 3 months. You will report to my garage on Grand River. We have cars there that need your skill. You will work off the interest with your labor. Your daughter will see a doctor my wife knows. We will add the doctor's cost to the principal. You will pay it back slowly when times are better. Do you agree to these terms?" Carl was stunned. It was not forgiveness. It was a restructuring. It was harder in a way because it bound him tighter to Joseph's world. But it preserved his dignity. He nodded, tears of relief mingling with the shame. "I agree. Thank you, Mr. Zerilli." As Carl left, Bill Taco, who had been listening from a corner, snorted. "Sentimental, Joe. You run a charity now." Joseph turned a cold gaze on his partner. "No, Bill. I am running a nation. That man will never work against us. His family will vote for our judges. His cousins will listen when we speak. He is not a debtor. He is a citizen of our city, and citizens defend their home." It was during this time that the federal government, in the form of a young, ambitious prohibition agent named Harold Anderson, began to take a sharper interest in Detroit. Anderson was a believer in the letter of the law, a man who saw the world in black and white. He targeted the remnants of the liquor trade, but his real goal was the top. He started making inquiries about the quiet, respectable businessman Joseph Zerilli, who seemed to be weathering the depression awfully well. Joseph learned of Anderson's interest from a friendly desk sergeant. It was a new kind of threat, not a rival with a gun, but the slow, grinding force of the state. He couldn't be reasoned with or bought, not directly. He had to be managed. He instructed his lawyers to be impeccably prepared. All his visible businesses were to be squeaky clean, their books in perfect order. The bakery, the linen company, the garbage routes, all were legitimate enterprises on paper. He distanced himself further from the day-to-day of the underground operations, using layers of intermediaries. One night, looking at the now ancient, paper-thin lemon peel in its case, he understood its lesson anew. The strength was in its flexibility, its resilience. It had adapted, dried, but retained its essence and its purpose. The empire he built was doing the same. It was sinking its roots into the fertile soil of human need, becoming part of the ecosystem of a struggling city. But the gaze of Agent Anderson was like a coming frost. Could his creation survive a direct, legal winter? The game was changing, and the stakes were no longer just streets and dollars, but years, decades, behind walls of a different kind. The comm center was preparing for a siege. The end of Prohibition in 1933 felt less like a defeat and more like a change in the weather. The wild, profitable storm had passed, leaving a landscape altered. For Joseph Zerilli, the repeal of the 18th Amendment was a confirmation of his long-held belief. Nothing lasts forever except the land and the relationships built upon it. The organization's liquor operations, already scaled back, were smoothly transitioned. Some of their best distillers and importers were set up in now legal ventures, with Joseph and his partners as silent, well-paid investors. The real money, he knew, had never been in the alcohol itself, but in the systems of distribution and protection they had built. Those systems could be repurposed. The more persistent chill came from the federal government. Agent Harold Anderson, now with a revived Bureau of Investigation under a relentless director named J. Edgar Hoover was a dog with a bone. He couldn't get Joseph on liquor charges anymore, so he shifted focus to tax evasion and conspiracy. The pressure was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of Joseph's life. Joseph's response was not to hide, but to build a brighter, more public facade. He invested heavily in real estate, buying up distressed properties and vacant lots as the city slowly began to breathe again under the New Deal. He became a familiar, if reserved, figure at certain charitable events, always donating anonymously but through channels that ensured the right people knew the source. He was constructing a portrait of Joseph Zerilli, community builder. This delicate dance was complicated by the rising star of a new national problem, the syndicate. Figures like Lucky Luciano from New York were pushing for a centralized national commission to arbitrate disputes and organize crime on a coast-to-coast scale. An invitation, which was really a summons, came for a meeting in upstate New York in 1934. Bill Taco was enthusiastic. "This is it, Joe. A seat at the big table. National influence." Joseph was wary. He had spent a lifetime consolidating control in Detroit, a city he understood down to its alleyways. The idea of answering to a board of directors in New York or Chicago, of having outsiders dictate terms in his territory, tasted bitter. "The big table has many chairs," he told Bill as they prepared to travel. "And the man at the head decides who gets fed. We are not beggars. We are kings in our own city. Remember that." The meeting was a revelation. It was held in a secluded castle-like mansion, filled with men whose names were whispered in newspapers across the country. Luciano, the sharp-eyed architect. Frank Costello, the polished political fixer. Al Capone's more strategic successors from Chicago. Joseph watched and listened more than he spoke. The proposals were about structuring the underworld like a corporation, dividing the country into territories, setting rules for war, creating a pension fund for imprisoned members. When asked for his thoughts on the Detroit territory, Joseph stood, his demeanor calm and respectful but firm. "Detroit is a unique ecosystem," he stated, his voice carrying in the grand room. "We have managed our affairs, our partnerships, our disputes, without external interference. We have peace. What you propose is sensible for places where there is war. We do not need a referee where the game is already played by mutual agreement." He was politely asserting Detroit's independence, signaling that while they would cooperate, they would not be subordinated. Luciano studied him, a flicker of respect in his gaze. Here was a man who wasn't impressed by the gathering, who thought in terms of local stability over imperial ambition. Compromise was reached. Detroit would be part of the commission, but it would retain significant autonomy. Joseph Zerilli and his partners were recognized as the undisputed authority in their region. Returning to Detroit, Joseph felt no triumph, only a new layer of complexity. Now he had to manage not just local rivalries and federal agents, but the expectations and occasional demands of a national body. It was another plate to spin. The personal and the professional collided soon after. His son, Anthony, was now a bright-eyed boy of 7. One afternoon, Joseph came home early to find Anthony building a complex structure with wooden blocks in the living room. "What is it, son?" Joseph asked, removing his hat and coat. "It's Detroit," Anthony declared proudly. "This is the train station. This is the bridge to Canada. And this," he said, pointing to a sturdy central tower of blocks, "is your office, Papa, where you help people with their jobs." Philomena, entering the room, caught Joseph's eye. Her look was a mixture of pride and profound anxiety. Joseph felt a deep pang. His son saw him as a businessman, a fixer, a pillar. He had no concept of the shadows that stretched from that tower of blocks. "That's very good, Anthony," Joseph said, his voice unusually soft. "A strong foundation is important. But remember, the tallest tower must be the strongest because everyone looks at it, and everyone feels the wind." He knelt and carefully adjusted a block at the base of the tower, making it more secure. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the most important work he'd done all week. He was building a legacy for his son, But that legacy was a double-edged sword. He was providing a world of safety and privilege, yet he was also constructing the very walls of a gilded cage that might one day trap Anthony, either within the family business or within the public's perception of it. Later that night, looking at the sleeping boy, Joseph felt the weight of his choices more than ever. Agent Anderson was a threat to his freedom. The commission was a threat to his autonomy. But his son's innocent admiration was a threat to his soul. He had to build a future where that tower of blocks could stand clean in the sun, where the name Zerilli could mean something beyond the whispers. The next phase was not about expansion, but about transformation. The Shadow King knew he had to find a way to step, partially at least, into the light. The late 1930s settled over Detroit like a layer of fine soot. Familiar, grimy, and persistent. The frantic energy of the boom and the bleak desperation of the bust had given way to a gritty, grinding normalcy. For Joseph Zerilli, this meant consolidation. The commission in New York was a reality, but he treated it as a distant senate, to be respected but not obeyed blindly. His focus remained local, fixed on deepening the roots of his operations into the bedrock of the city. His legitimate portfolio grew strategically. He moved into garbage hauling in earnest, consolidating smaller companies into a single, efficient entity. It was a perfect business. Everyone produced trash, recession, or boom. He invested in vending machine routes, placing coin-operated marvels that dispensed cigarettes and peanuts in factories and union halls across the city. They were tiny, silent profit centers, spreading his influence one nickel at a time. But the shadow of the law grew longer. Agent Harold Anderson had been promoted, but his files on Zerilli had been passed on. The federal government's approach was becoming more sophisticated, less about bootlegging and more about patterns of income, about connections between the respectable businessman and the underworld figures who still quietly reported to him. Joseph's defense was a masterclass in compartmentalization. He employed a sharp, meticulous lawyer named Arthur Schiff, a man who believed in the letter of the law and charged accordingly. Schiff's job was to ensure a pristine legal wall existed between Joseph and the street. All legitimate business dealings were conducted with ironclad contracts. Joseph's personal finances were boringly orderly. He lived well, but not lavishly. A solid home, good suits, a single Cadillac. There were no flashy jewels, no sprawling mansions that would attract undue attention. This careful life was disrupted by a problem from the past. A former associate from the Prohibition days, a man named Leo Lips Mavriki, had been caught in a net cast by the Treasury Department for tax evasion. Facing decades in prison, Lips, who had handled some of the riverfront logistics, decided to talk. He offered to trade what he knew about the old liquor empire for leniency. The news came to Joseph through a circuitous route, a clerk in the federal courthouse who was on the payroll. It was a cold splash of reality. Lips hadn't been part of the inner circle, but he knew enough to draw uncomfortable lines, to name names that could lead investigators down a path. Bill Taco's solution was typically direct. He's in the county lockup. A message can be sent. A man who can't talk can't deal. Joseph, sitting in his office above the bakery, watched the afternoon light slant across his desk. He thought of his son Anthony's block tower. A violent solution here might shore up one wall only to bring the whole structure down under a hail of subpoenas and police scrutiny. "No," Joseph said finally, his voice tired. "That's what they expect. That's the old way. Anderson and his kind, they want us to act like animals. Confirms their story. We will act like businessmen. Arthur Schiff will become his lawyer." Taco stared, incredulous. "Our lawyer? Defend him? Schiff will visit him. He will explain that we are aware of his situation. He will also explain that we are prepared to provide for his family, handsomely, if he serves his time with dignity. Schiff will note that the federal case is strong, but that with a quiet plea he might see daylight again in 10, 12 years. An angry man with a ruined family becomes a talker. A provided-for man with hope stays quiet. It was a ruthless calculus of human nature. Joseph was betting on long-term loyalty fueled by financial security over short-term fear. Schiff, with his impeccable suit and expensive briefcase, visited Leo Mavriki. The message was delivered not as a threat, but as a bleak, professional assessment followed by a generous offer of welfare. Lips took the deal. He pled guilty, said nothing, and his wife received anonymous monthly envelopes that kept her in her home. The immediate crisis passed, but it left Joseph feeling the walls of his world subtly contracting. Every old friend was now a potential liability. This pressure seeped into his home. Anthony, now 10, was a bright, observant boy. He began to notice things. The men who visited his father were different from the other Father's friends. They were almost too respectful, their laughter a bit too controlled. He noticed the way people in their neighborhood looked at his father. Not just with respect, but with a layer of something else, something like wariness. One evening, Anthony asked a question at the dinner table. "Papa, at school, Jimmy Fratello said his dad calls you the Don. What's a Don?" Philomena froze, her fork hovering above her plate. The air in the cozy dining room went still. Joseph finished chewing a piece of bread deliberately. He looked at his son, not with anger, but with a profound seriousness. "It is an old word from Italy," he said evenly. "It means a man of respect, a man people come to when they have a problem, like a very strong union representative. But it is a word from the old country, Anthony. Here I am just a businessman. You understand? We do not use that word." He held his son's gaze until Anthony nodded, though the boy's eyes were still clouded with confusion. The explanation was a shield, but Joseph knew it was thin. The dichotomy of his life was becoming impossible to hide. He was building a legitimate empire for his son to inherit, but the very act of building it ensured that inheritance would be forever stained. After tucking Anthony into bed that night, Joseph stood by his own bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street. The lemon peel in its case on his dresser was now a fragile brown artifact, a museum piece from a simpler time. He had navigated wars with rivals, economic collapse, and national syndicates. But the battle for his son's perception, for the future meaning of his name, felt like the most uncertain fight of all. The federal government was a patient enemy, but time itself, and the inevitable curiosity of a smart boy growing into a man, might prove to be an even more formidable foe. The foundation was secure, but the legacy was still being written, and the pen, he feared, was no longer entirely in his hand. The drumbeat of war in Europe was a distant echo in Detroit until the day it wasn't. The news of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 crackled through the city with the force of a physical shockwave. For Joseph Zerilli, now a man in his early 40s with threads of gray at his temples, the declaration of war presented not just a national crisis, but a profound business and personal inflection point. The city transformed overnight. The auto plants ceased making cars and began spewing out tanks, jeeps, and bombers in a breathtaking, relentless parade. The streets were flooded with new workers, men, women, black families from the South in the Great Migration, all drawn by the promise of high-paying defense jobs. The old neighborhood dynamics shifted, and with them, the underworld economy. Joseph called a meeting of the partnership. The mood was uncertain. Rationing would cripple certain black markets. Scrap metal drives would make old schemes difficult. But Joseph, ever the strategist, saw the contours of a new landscape. "The war is not our problem," he told the assembled men in the back room of a union hall they influenced. "It is our new client. The government needs everything, and it needs it now. Steel, rubber, transportation, labor. We are in the business of providing what is needed." He orchestrated a pivot. Their garbage hauling companies won lucrative contracts for scrap metal collection, with a healthy percentage of the collected material falling off the books and into the hands of friendly foundries for a premium. Their control over certain Teamster Union locals became more valuable than ever, ensuring smooth labor relations at key war plants for a fee and with the understanding that certain shipping and trucking contracts would be steered their way. It was a deeper, more dangerous game, profiting from the patriotism of a nation at war. On the home front, Anthony was now a teenager, caught in the tidal wave of patriotic fervor. Posters of Uncle Sam pointed from every wall. Newsreels showed heroic battles. His boyish confusion about his father hardened into a simmering, adolescent suspicion. He saw the new cars in their driveway when no one else could get them, the extra gasoline coupons, the prime cuts of meat that appeared despite ration stamps. The clash came one evening in 1943. Anthony, now 14 and brimming with a righteous anger fueled by a history lesson on war profiteers, confronted his father in his study. "Jimmy Fratello's older brother is getting shipped to Sicily," Anthony said, his voice tight. "He's going to fight, and we're here. What are we doing, Papa?" "Getting rich." Joseph looked up from his ledger, his face a mask of calm. "We are doing what we have always done, providing. The factories need to run. The streets need to be clean. The materials need to move. By stealing scrap metal? By paying off union guys?" Anthony shot back, a line he'd overheard from a bragging older cousin. The air left the room. Joseph slowly closed the ledger. He stood up, not in anger, but with a weary authority. "You listen to me, Anthony. This world, it is not the newsreel. It is not black and white. The men who sign the contracts in Washington, they get rich. The factory owners, they get rich. We ensure the men who do the work, our people, get their share. We keep the peace so the tanks can be built. That is our contribution." "It's dirty," Anthony muttered, looking away. Joseph came around the desk, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Anthony flinched, but Joseph held firm. "Yes, it is. The world is dirty. The question is not whether you get your hands dirty. It is what you build with them. We are building a future for this family. A future where you will not have to make the choices I have made." It was the closest he had ever come to an admission. Anthony heard it, and the weight of it scared him more than any denial. He pulled away and left the room. Joseph stood alone, the ghost of his son's disgust hanging in the air. He was losing him not to rebellion but to morality. The federal pressure, momentarily diverted by the war effort, returned in a new form. A different agent, younger, sharper, named Corrigan, came to visit Joseph's office. He didn't talk about taxes or prohibition. He talked about sabotage of the war effort and diversion of critical materials. The threat was existential. In wartime, such charges could carry consequences far beyond prison. Joseph, with Arthur Schiff at his side, met the threat with steely, formal cooperation. He opened his legitimate books. He showed the contracts for scrap collection, all in perfect order. He demonstrated the efficiency of his hauling companies. He was, on paper, a model contractor. The agent left frustrated, but the message was clear. The government was now looking at him through the lens of national security. That night, Joseph didn't look at the lemon peel. Instead, he looked at a photograph of his family, taken years earlier, himself, Philomena, a young, smiling Anthony. The future he was building felt more fragile than ever. The war was creating a firewall of patriotism that his son was using to judge him, and the government was wielding as a new weapon. His old methods, quiet influence, strategic partnership, were being challenged by the sheer, blinding light of a national cause. He realized then that survival was no longer enough. He needed to perform a transformation in plain sight. He needed to become, not just in secret but in public, a patriot. He directed substantial, and this time public, donations to war bond drives. He allowed his picture to be taken after much negotiation, presenting a check. He offered his trucking fleet at a discount for certain official purposes. It was a calculated, expensive campaign to paint the name Zerilli in red, white, and blue. He was building a fortress of respectability, brick by public brick, while the foundations of his real empire worked in the shadows to feed the insatiable war machine. He was walking a razor's edge between traitor and benefactor, between the father his son wanted and the man he needed to be to secure that son's future. The home front, for Joseph Zerilli, had become the most complex and perilous battlefield of all. The end of the war in 1945 brought not peace, but a roaring, chaotic release. Detroit convulsed with celebration, then settled into a new, powerful rhythm as the arsenal of democracy retooled to become the consumer engine of the world. For Joseph Zerilli, the post-war boom was a tide of almost unimaginable wealth, but it carried with it new, sharper dangers. The world had gotten smaller, brighter, and more inquisitive. The family moved to a larger, finer home in Palmer Woods, a neighborhood of stately brick houses and sweeping lawns. It was a world away from the crowded streets of Little Sicily. Joseph's legitimate businesses flourished. The garbage hauling empire was now a city-wide utility. His vending machine company, Zenith Amusements, chirped and clattered in every factory break room. He had silent pieces of casinos in newly glamorous Las Vegas, a town built on the same kind of thirsty dreams he'd once quenched in Detroit. But the shadow of his past lengthened. The war had created a unified, confident federal government and a public with a taste for tidy narratives. Gangsters were no longer seen as complex figures of local order, but as national villains. An ambitious senator from Tennessee named Estes Kefauver was making noises about a national investigation into organized crime. The real threat, however, was much closer to home. Anthony, now a young man of 17, was a storm of contradictions. He drove a fine car, wore excellent clothes, and enjoyed the privileges his father's wealth provided. Yet he wore this comfort like an itchy suit. He had developed a sharp, intellectual disdain for the source of it all. He was planning to attend the University of Michigan to study business and law, a path Joseph outwardly championed but inwardly feared. An educated son was a weapon that could turn in any direction. Their clashes were no longer about childish morality, but about ideology. "You talk about building, Papa?" Anthony said one night after a tense dinner, his voice cool and analytical. "But your foundation is sand. It's built on hidden deals and silence. Real empires are built on steel and public stock offerings." Joseph felt a flare of anger, banked it, and replied with forced calm. "And who do you think gets the contracts to haul the steel? Who ensures the unions at the stock exchange don't strike? The world you read about in your textbooks, Anthony, it is the clean, painted room. We are the plumbing in the walls. Without it, the whole house floods." "Plumbing doesn't have to be corrupt," Anthony shot back. "It has to be effective," Joseph said, ending the conversation. But the divide was now a canyon. He was losing his son not to anger, but to a different vision of America, one of transparent corporate legitimacy that had no room for a man like him. Professionally, the pressure crystallized in the form of a man who was both an asset and a liability. Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa, the fiery, brilliant leader of the Teamsters, was rising like a rocket. Joseph and the partnership had nurtured him, seeing in his control of the nation's truck drivers the ultimate leverage. But Hoffa was a wild card, charismatic and reckless, drawing a spotlight that Joseph had spent a lifetime avoiding. Joseph met with Hoffa in a private room at the Statler Hotel. Hoffa, all nervous energy and sharp eyes, laid out his vision for a national Teamster pension fund, a river of money that could build cities. "It's the future, Joe," Hoffa said, pounding the table. "We'll loan it to builders, to casinos, to anybody. We'll own a piece of everything that moves." Joseph listened, sipping his espresso. "Jimmy, money that moves leaves a trail. A bright, wide trail for the IRS, for the FBI, for senators like Kefauver who want to make a name. You must be careful. The walls have ears now, and they are connected to Washington." Hoffa waved a dismissive hand. "They're bureaucrats. I've got the votes. I've got the men." "You have a target on your back," Joseph said quietly. "And by association, so do we. Our arrangement must remain quiet. The loans can flow, but the paperwork must be perfect. The decisions must be business decisions, not favors." He was trying to impose his old-world discipline on Hoffa's new-world ambition, and he knew he was fighting a losing battle. The most personal blow came from an unexpected direction. Joseph's father, Antonio, the man who had peeled the lemon so long ago, passed away quietly in his sleep. At the funeral, surrounded by the old guard faces of the Detroit underworld and the new, slicker associates from his legitimate ventures, Joseph felt unmoored. The anchor of that silent, principled generation was gone. The mantle was fully his now, and it felt heavier than ever. After the graveside service, Anthony, standing beside him in a dark suit, spoke softly. Nano was from a different world, wasn't he? Joseph looked at his son, seeing the intellectual curiosity in his eyes, even in grief. Yes, a world where a man's word and his family were his entire empire. It was simpler, not better, but simpler. Is that the world you wanted? Anthony asked, the question not an accusation, but a genuine inquiry. Joseph gazed at his father's grave, then at the skyline of the city he helped build and secretly controlled. I wanted the empire, he said, the honesty surprising them both. I just didn't know how complicated the throne would be. That night, in his study, he held the ancient lemon peel. It was so fragile now it seemed it would dissolve to dust at a touch. It was no longer a symbol of strength, but of time, of the irreversible process of becoming what you are. He had built a fortune, a reputation, a legacy, but he could feel the winds of change rising. A meddling senator, a reckless ally, a son who dreamed in a different language. The post-war sunshine was brilliant, but it illuminated everything, including the cracks in the foundation he had built. The next fight, he knew, would not be in the streets or the back rooms, but in the hearing chambers of Washington and in the heart of his own home. The 1950s dawned with a cold, electronic glare. The enemy was no longer a rival bootlegger or a stubborn union boss. It was the television camera, the Senate subpoena, the headline in a national magazine. Senator Estes Kefauver's special committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce became a national spectacle, and Detroit was squarely in its sights. For Joseph Zerilli, it was the moment the plumbing in the walls was ripped out and displayed under Klieg lights. He watched the hearings from his study, the grim faces of men he knew, some friends, some rivals, flashing on the screen, taking the Fifth Amendment, being painted as parasites on the American body. He knew his name was in the files, a whispered benchmark in the testimony. His lawyer, Arthur Schiff, was a constant presence, preparing him for the inevitable summons. They have no financial crime, no violence to pin on you, Schiff assured him. They have gossip, association, old stories. Your public record is clean. You are a businessman. Remember that. But the pressure was corrosive. The carefully maintained separation between his two worlds felt paper-thin. The vending machine company received sudden, intrusive audits. The garbage hauling contracts faced re-evaluation by newly nervous city officials. The respect he commanded now had a nervous edge to it, as associates wondered who might be wearing a wire. The most painful fracture was with Anthony. Now a student at the University of Michigan, he came home less frequently. When he did, it was with a detached academic air. The hearings were a topic of debate in his classes. One weekend, over a strained dinner, Anthony referred to them. It's fascinating in a tragic way, he said, not looking at his father. These men, they built these intricate systems, but they're based on a code that doesn't exist in the modern world. It's like watching a dinosaur not realizing the meteor has already hit. Joseph put down his fork. The house was silent except for the ticking of a clock. The dinosaur still has teeth, Anthony, and the meteor is just noise and light until it strikes. But it will strike, Anthony said, finally meeting his eyes. There was no anger there, only a sad certainty. The world is becoming transparent, Papa. There's no room for shadows anymore. Not like yours. It was the death knell of hope. His son didn't hate him. He had simply analyzed him and found him obsolete. Joseph had built an empire to pass on, and the heir apparent had judged it a relic. When his own subpoena arrived, it was almost a relief. The performance was set. Dressed in a conservative, expensive suit, with Arthur Schiff a pillar of legal propriety at his side, Joseph Zerilli took the stand in a packed, hot hearing room. Flashbulbs popped. Senators peered down with theatrical gravity. For hours, they threw names at him. Purple Gang remnants, Bill Taco, Sam Giancana, Jimmy Hoffa. To every question about specific illegal acts, he gave the same rehearsed, polite reply. On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer the question on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me. He was a statue of silence. He didn't bluster. He didn't smirk. He was a businessman invoking his constitutional rights. The senators grew frustrated. They presented old police reports. Hearsay, but no witness, no document, tied Joseph Zerilli directly to a crime. He was a ghost in their machine. In his final exchange, the chief counsel, trying one last time, asked, "Mr. Zerilli, are you a part of, or have you ever been a part of, a secret criminal organization known as the Mafia?" Joseph looked directly into the camera, his face a mask of calm integrity. "Sir," he said, his voice clear and firm, "I am an American citizen, a businessman from Detroit. I have never heard of such an organization, except in the movies and the newspapers." It was the perfect, untouchable lie. He was excused. He had not won, but he had not lost. He had endured. That night, back in Detroit, he did not go to a celebratory dinner. He went home. The house was quiet. Philomena, ever steadfast, had a meal waiting, but they ate in silence. The battle was over, but the war for his soul was decided. He went to his study and took out the old metal cigarette case. He opened it and looked at the lemon peel. It was now just a brown, translucent whisper, a fossil. He could crush it to dust with a touch. He didn't. He thought of his father, Antonio, peeling it in that steamy kitchen, teaching him about the sour strength of life. He thought of the empire of shadows and substance he had built. He thought of Anthony, who saw only the shadows. Joseph Zerilli had navigated a century's tumult. He had been a son, a messenger, a strategist, a king, and finally a spectacle. He had outlasted Prohibition, the Depression, the war, and the Senate. But he could not outlast time or the future his son represented. He carefully closed the case. The peel would stay there, a private memorial to a world that was, to the sourness he had mastered, and to the strength that had, in the end, built something lasting, even if its truest shape would never be understood by the outside world. He turned off the light. The story of Joseph Zerilli, the real man, would not end in a hail of bullets or a prison cell. It would fade, like an old photograph, into the complicated history of a city he helped shape, leaving behind a legacy as durable and as ambiguous as the concrete in its foundations. The calm center had held, but the storm had finally passed, leaving only silence in its wake.